Hello everyone, today we talk about Eastern Iranian, Afghan and Transoxanian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century for our Eurasian Historical Regional Warfare series. I think this may be actually the last region that I introduced. Actually, we still have to finish the East Asian chapter, aside from, of course, the fact that I make lots of videos about all those countries way more in depth, and we just began, even though, made tens of videos already. We have to talk more about medieval Indian warfare, but for the rest, the series that we started, I think 3 years ago or something, by now has been completed, at least in this major overviews of, in fact, pretty big regional scenarios. For this matter, you can check out the links to the videos that I posted in the top fix comment. As usual, the most pertaining sort of ones, considering the video that I'm treating here. And as usual, we introduce the region in its sort of essential military features. Then we'll pass through some archaeological dimension. I think I'm going to make this into separated videos because there is a lot to say in general. At the beginning of the series, I tended to compress things a little bit more, but we always covered the fundamentals in a satisfactory fashion. Then we will get, with other series, a bit more in depth in this single milieu. So throughout the early Islamic period, Iran was culturally divided into two distinct regions, profoundly influencing its military and so at all levels of arms and armor, tactics, organization. The eastern provinces, including Khorasan, Sistan, Sistan, partly with modern Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan, and southeastern Makran, shared significant cultural military affinities with the Turkic or Turkified northeastern regions, such as Jurian, Tukharistan, Badakhshan, Khwarezm, and Mawara al-Nahr, known as Transoxanian, meaning, quote, that which is across the river Oxus. Khorasan is this vast region encompassing northeastern Iran and part of modern Turkmenistan, and it was, at the time, a cultural and economic hub. Here we start essentially from the fading of the so-called Islamic Golden Era, and you know that a great part of the major philosophers, scientists, inventors, etc., came exactly from in the entire, not just caliphate, but beyond, came from this area. In particular, of course, the Abbasids would benefit of that because of greater sort of geographical proximity, but not only. Then you have the Sistan, Sistan, straddling modern Iran and Afghanistan, known for its agricultural wealth, or rather, it was a bit of a more brutal area. Khorasan historically was a bit in between the steppes and sedentary civilization in terms of development. That's why it was also so effervescent, at least for some types of innovation. Jurian, located along the Caspian Sea's southeastern coast, and Tukharistan, Badakhshan, spanning northern Afghanistan to Tajikistan, were key frontier zones. In these, you basically have China and Khwarezm, that is the same actual Khorasan, depends on how you want to call it, south of the Aral Sea, and as such also a fertile oasis to a degree. Makran was rather a coastal region in southeastern Iran and Pakistan, a trade conduit mostly. So you understand here this whole arc, right, stretching from the Caspian to the Indian Ocean, sort of skirting the most advanced parts of Persia in the west. Transoxiana itself was subdivided into Sugd, Fargana, and Shash. I made a video about Iron Age, Bactrian, Fergana, and Sogdian warfare, looking in particular at their equestrian history. The Fergana Fergana Valley horses were, as you know, considered like probably the top of war horses in antiquity. Historically, these areas had been sort of invested by repeated waves of nomadic invaders stemming from essentially the center of all, the mother of the womb of all Asian hordes, at least from some time onward, the Tian Shan, right? That we will perhaps make further videos on, because really they're not just breathtaking places in a naturalistic sense, but they were properly the ethnogenetic location of some of the fiercest and most successful conquerors in the steppes, especially in the moment of sort of switch from the Indo-European to the Turco-Mongol dominance. I made a Eurasian warfare series that analyzes all these waves and more or less who came from where. So this is really a huge area that it's difficult to treat even just for the time between the 11th and the 14th century. Quite composite, under many influences, but we're not scared to describe it, also because there are some common points in this. Sukt, that we just mentioned, was also centered around modern Samarkand and Bukhara. These were incredibly important trade posts for the intercontinental commerce across Eurasia, longitudinally speaking, and the wall Sukt was a historic Iranian cultural region. Fergana is in modern Uzbekistan, famed, as we remember, for its horses. We also made a video about the ancient, sort of, say, Persian, but actually Fergan horse that was prized. Like even Augustus, when he conquered Egypt, wanted to bring these magnificent beasts, magnificent mounts to Rome. Shash instead corresponds to modern Tashkent, where it was also a trade center. So these regions, though frequently embroiled in warfare, because, as you know, the bottom line of this area is, it was particularly unstable from a political point of view, but not even too much at some point, as we will see now, maintain, in fact, a relatively clear historical trajectory during this phase. For example, by the early 11th century, the Ghaznavids, really never made a video about that, they were really cool, a Turkic dynasty originating from the city of Ghazna in eastern Afghanistan, known for their military prowess and patronage of Persian culture, ruled or held, because they weren't from Persia, but of course were co-opted in a broader sense by its same civilization that they used to foster their own power and military might as well, ruled or held suzerainty over most of this area at some point, except Transoxania, while the Buvayids, a Shia Persian dynasty from Dailam in northern Iran, renowned for their intellectual contributions and control over the Abbasid Caliphate at some point, governed western Iran and Iraq. The Dailamites were also at some point quite famous mercenaries that kept also successfully in place, like some archaic, even pre-Turkic type of, especially mounted warfare. They were mostly infantry at some point, and they were used as soldiers pretty much far and wide, also by the Fatimids and so on, even successfully beating the Ghulam cavalry. The Ghaznavids were really the big power at this point. They achieved the unprecedented expansion of Islamic rule into northern India. So injecting a very interesting melange of Persian, Turkic, even Arab military styles that were, however, very increasingly sort of Central Asian in profile and tendentially, in fact, semi-nomadic, as different from at least what had historically settled down in India in terms of probably military systems, in spite, in fact, of repeated waves also of semi-nomadic conquerors, at least in some parts of the same subcontinent. Transoxiana and portions of modern Xinjiang at this period, if we're talking Chinese Turkestan, were governed by the Ilak Khans, a Turkic dynasty of Karluk origin, whose semi-nomadic lifestyle and limited written records obscure their history. More or less, we know how these peoples fought. We made really lots of videos about steppes warfare throughout the whole year, but don't worry, can always come back on everything that we've already covered in ever greater depth. In the late 20s of the 11th century, the Oghuz, Turks, a nomadic tribal confederation from the Central Asian steppes, known for their mobility and archery skills under the leadership of a family claiming descent from Seljuk ibn Yaqub, began capturing cities in Khorasan, transitioning from mercenaries serving local rulers to independent sovereigns. These were essentially the founders. They had partly backstabbed the broader Oghuz establishment, but had become so successful that, as you understand from the name of the founder, by 1050, these Seljuks, so as a Sunni Turkic dynasty named after the aforementioned founder, established a vast empire blending Persian and Islamic traditions, and had by then extended their control into western Iran, confining the Ghaznavids to eastern Afghanistan and the Islamic regions of northern India. Obviously enough, the Seljuks prioritized Iran and the West. That remained essentially their regional power base, so that even if they reached the Mediterranean from one side, they again controlled this eastern frontier to some extent. It came to essentially manipulate and, in this sense, toxically relate with the Abbasid Caliphate in their zealotic, sort of newly converted zealotic fanatism, remained centered on Persia and witnessed to the almost immediate fragmentation and decentralization of government across all these principalities that, a bit like in other political systems, including in Christendom, maintain a principle of seniorate and essentially legitimization of power from a dynastic side, as descendants from the whole house, and of course, in a broader sense for Sunni Islam, the in fact sultanial delegation of power from the Caliph of Baghdad. Right? We talk naturally a lot about Seljuk warfare, perhaps not as sort of comprehensively as we should, but again, step by step, also here we're covering the whole picture. Needless to say, the Seljuks prioritized Persia in the West as the most advanced, urbanized, at least by Persian standard, part of the Iranian plateau, while their Transoxanian territories soon fell to the Karakhanids, yet another Turkic dynasty of Karluk and Uyghur descent who ruled as vassals and promoted Islamic scholarship in Central Asia. Family disputes fragmented the Seljuk Empire already by the early 12th century, yet their hold on eastern Iran persisted until the late 12th century, when it succumbed to a rebellious governor from Khorasan, as we've seen, the fertile region south of the Aral Sea. The Khwarezmian Shahs were a dynastic rule originary of the local region, known for their aggressive military campaigns and brief unification of Central Asia even, fiercely martial in nature. We partially discussed their military ethos that was a blend also of previous Indo-European suggestions with the newly sort of Turkic dominance. And we've seen it especially in the video about Islamic military music, when essentially the the transcendence of divinity was symbolized by the martial music itself, and in particular the Nakarakhana. So that would turn out in the whole Islamic world to symbolize the actual power of the various Islamic rulers. It was essentially a military band substantiating in the most important instrument, the drum, right? And the Khwarezmians basically displayed a golden drum, literally pulled by a war chariot, just like in the Bronze Age, still at this point, the Middle Ages, in a very symbolic way, because that played, of course, the transcendental music of God that manifested, that literally moved the armies with this military musical instruments. And it was surrounded by smaller drums that were the symbol of power delegation to to subjects of the Khwarezmians in this case, in fact, played by the princes/hostages of the various, say, the science, essentially, the various rulers tributary to Khwarezmians that render homage to the higher, golden, and bigger drum. This is a beautiful vision, just to give you an idea of what these people were about. The Khwarezmians briefly unified Eastern Islamic territories here before their obliteration by the Mongol invasions, notoriously enough. Eastern Afghanistan also came under Khwarezmian rule to that extent. The Ghurids, a Sunni dynasty from the rugged Ghor region of central Afghanistan, originally of possible Eastern Iranian or Tajik origin even, rose from local chieftains to regional power, replaced the Ghaznavids in the mid-12th century, but were later confined to Islamic India by the same Khwarezmians, only to be succeeded by the Mamluk, naturally not the Egyptian Mamluks, but literally, in fact, the Mamluk, quote, slave kings of Delhi. As you know, Mamluk as Ghulam is just yet another way to define the slave/serf soldiers, military of the. That is very part of sort of the idea of Islamic subjection, etc. We'll talk more, if anything, about this from a theological point of view. The slave kings of Delhi, these Mamluks, were a dynasty founded by, in fact, these forces who established a powerful sultanate in northern India after having essentially taken over power from at the expenses of their own masters, as it was normally the case. Also, this happened with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. We made also lots of videos about them. Naturally, there was a certain similarity in this whole region that is part of the broader Turco and later Mongol expansion, as we will see now, in type of warfare. Historically, Persia, we have just discussed it recently for different reasons, was essentially a feudal country, like in the West, more centralized, more urbanized even, but heavily sort of oligarchic, privatized. And this broader northern East, as you understand here, is incredibly composite. Had historically remained a frontier for many empires, thinking in the same ones of Alexander, the Seleucids. Think about the Bactrians that had seceded, and there are very distinct regional realities that are unstable because, again, they're a hybrid between the steppe and more sedentary places. They don't have enough surplus to last too long. They don't have a very strong statehood. So there is a lot of back and forth, especially from the de facto next door Central Asia, in stricter terms, war bands. Right? There are peoples, as we'll understand now, that weren't even merely mounted or nomadic. Think about, I don't know, the Pashto, like if you look at Afghanistan, there were rough mountaineers that rendered life quite difficult to lots of these conquerors that, however, did manage at some point to control the valleys, the fertile basins, and so on. So it's an incredibly variegated picture. Khorasan and Transoxania, in particular, profoundly shaped Islamic arms, armor, and military systems. Exactly because of their hybrid nature between the steppe and the lower lands. If you look at the Timurids, just to give you an idea of Timur the Lame, of some of the most compositely effective armies in the history of mankind, they had this Turco-Mongol, even Iranian background, plus some pinch of Indian, some sort of also further Western element of expansion, Tatar elements, for example, and lots of stuff bordering the Golden Horde, different sort of more primitive hordes in Central Asia, the remnants also of the bigger oceanic rule of the Ghaznavids, from which they hopefully, sort of tendentially at least claimed to descend, with an hour, of course, of sacrality. The composite nature of these military achievements is readily identified. The Turks were dominant in the steppes. They were actually sort of the more aggressive, the more militarized forces that were essentially immediate, like the Seljuks, for example, sort of subsumed by the more advanced civilized populations that, however, sort of delegated power a bit to them. It's a blend that you can find, I don't know, like with the Romans, with the Germans and the Romans in the migration era, and the syncresis, as you know, at some point is inextricable. The Turks did not live better in the steppes, and of course the areas that they came to rule over were conferred them this power to stabilize the region as they were more advanced, providing supplies and so on. We've seen this often also in other videos about medieval Persia, for example, when the Ilkhanate was established. The Mongols, rough and tough, sort of primitive, actually backwards, if you're really honest about this, tried to maintain almost, in fact, a steppe kind of lifestyle, but they were soon subsumed with essentially a more sophisticated and advanced Persian civilization. Well, here in Eastern Persia, things are sort of, if you can't speak even of Persia, that, as you know, is almost a synecdochal term for Iran. That is something, in fact, vaster, also vaguer as a term, is way more shaded, right? At the same time, you can appreciate, in fact, this connubium, again, Turkic, mostly mounted element, with a majority of the population, including segments of military aristocracy as well, so also the heavy cavalry, being of Eastern Iranian descent. And therefore, by the way, although de facto becoming Turkic, think about, again, Tamerlane claimed Turco-Mongol descendants, but we think he could be simply Iranian, Indo-European in by majority. There was a blend. There is no doubt here, generally speaking, that the political identity came to sort of overlap with the one of the dominant rulers and the ones who had achieved more. There were lots of Indo-European warriors in these areas that had historically sort of a bit softened up in later antiquity, taken over by the Turks, that however still participated with their own military culture. Remember what we just said about the Khwarezmian symbol of power, something incredibly striking, as in part this level of Islamic iconoclastic preference for something more, in fact, ideal, not graphically shown. It's in the form of military music itself, but with a massive and unequivocal symbolism of the older Indo-European war territory dominance of thousands of years. But this is incredibly fascinating. And this tells you also how these basins were sort of displaying an actual continuity of millennia. We don't even consider, because we almost don't consider even as countries, because we don't talk about them as respective units, and therefore it seems as if it was just a blend and melange, but it was an important continuing. Pockets of Sogdian culture representing the northeastern Iranian peoples, known for their sophisticated urban traditions also, and Sogdian language, persisted beyond Islamic and Chinese frontiers, notably in Semirkye, south of Lake Balkhash, where a Sub-Sassanian civilization endured until the 12th century. I made also videos about Kushan warfare, Kushan and Kuchan, that are actually connected also etymologically, because they were the same people. Some sanitarized, some not, some of which went over to India, essentially Indo-Scythians, and the Tokharians, or depending on how you want to define and consider them. This is incredibly important, because you would think the Turks take over the steppe. How does it happen? Immediately. So there was, of course, a great continuity also in the persistence of specific Iranian polities, in Indo-Aryan polities properly in this broader space until even the High Middle Ages. And they were subsumed, if anything, into the broader Turkic culture, but they still exhibited, given that the area, as you understand, is also very diverse in terms of actual landscape. It's not just steppe. There are actual cities. Don't think urbanization like, I don't know, in Europe or in China. That's something more primitive, but still by steppe standards is a big deal. And some of these places were incredibly rich, especially because they found themselves remaining over the Silk Road that also, in fact, the Turks came to control. The Dekhans were pre-Islamic Persian land-owning noblemen who served as local administrators and warriors under the Sasanian Empire, retaining a diminishing yet notable role in Transoxania and Khorasan into the early Seljuk period as well. Imagine even the horizons of these peoples, how even from Western Iran, you can, as a Seljuk Sultan, you can attemptably control or at least claim overlordship in a journey over spaces so distant and and different. And it's really, I made a video about Seljuk warfare from the Chinese side of the story, documentarily speaking. It's fantastic because, of course, we know mostly about them from the Westerners, but there is probably a dimension there from Chinese sources that makes you bridge properly the sense of East and West that many of these hordes had sort of maintained even in their iconographic identity as far as, were they closer to China or to Europe. Central Asian military styles, including decorative belt pendant, a hallmark of the military elite, by the way, Altaic harness decorations and slightly curved Turkic sabers spread to Iran and other Islamic regions between the 9th and the 11th centuries. This is relevant for a couple of reasons. First of all, the spread of sabers is something indicative of essentially the Turco-Mongol substitution to the local Indo-European elite that had historically maintained sort of this straight swords, more, preferentially designed to strike armor, even piercing it. And the Turks correspond to a phase in steppe warfare where the sort of the system had broken itself, right? From the migration era, people had actually become poorer. And so these Turkic hordes were actually not faring better. This is what I say about this. If you look at the so-called barbarian invasion, wherever we are, it's not like the barbarians, even when they break through, are actually having it great, or say the steppe witnessed a better time, or the cemeteries witnessed a better time. Everything sort of exhausted itself, cooled off. And Turkic society was, generally speaking, per capita poorer than what the Indo-European steppe one had been. The elite is ever more elite, they're fewer. There are all these broken horse archers without even armor. And as a consequence, their favorite weapon is actually a simpler one to handle, such as the saber. Don't get me wrong, there are sabers that are massive, all right? And there isn't even this enormous difference but with the straight sword. But tendentially, the design is sort of fitting for some lighter type of almost hit-and-run engagement than that sort of armored versus armored clash. And this is obviously true by degrees, right? It's not like, again, these things did not continue, but the degrees different. The other interesting aspect is, and as we've seen with the Dailamis in other videos about, for example, Mesopotamian warfare during the same era, is that Persia as a whole, regardless of the Islamic conquests, of the Arab conquest, had retained throughout the centuries up to essentially the 9th, 11th, a fundamentally military original profile, literally the one that you could have seen not quite just simply from Sasanian times, but similar to that. It hadn't been fundamentally altered. Persian culture was tendentially more knightly, heavier, more shock-based. They had also lighter troops, but not as the Turks of the steppes, as we just documented. This culture survives the Islamic invasions and fundamentally gets more influenced by the Turks, if anything, to change a bit the proportions in the 9th, 11th century. There are, as we will see also in the videos about iconography and archaeology, lots of continuities as far as properly a native Persian military style is concerned. But of course, the Turks are overrunning at this point the entire Islamic world militarily-wise. They're carriers themselves of some sort of more equestrian and in part also feudal, but more primitively so, oligarchic element with, again, this weakening of sort of the middle element in between. Needless to say, this part of eastern Iran is more affected by this because this area was sort of poorer, so it would be destabilized, exhausted more, and so it sort of changed more toward that Turkic direction in military style. Horse archery, a long-standing feature also of Iranian warfare, in these areas evolved distinctly. Unlike the nomadic harassment tactics of Central Asia, the pre-Islamic Sasanian period had developed controlled rapid shooting by disciplined cavalry units, essentially. They had heavily specialized between the cataphracts. At some point, even paradoxically, the heavier cataphracts existed in Arsacid times, at the time, properly of the early empire from a Roman point of view. In the Sasanian era, they had actually watered them down because they were too costly, but they had increased their effectiveness by collective investment. And so Sasanian army of late antiquity was more civilized, more effective, but they had also watered down a bit the quality of the individual knight. But they were a greater might to begin with. So this foundation informed the sophisticated Mamluk or Ghulam horse archery during this period of Turkic influence. We've seen, again, the Mamluks are these enslaved soldiers of Turkic or also other origin from a strictly ethnic point of view. As we've seen, there were so many Indo-Europeans in the steppes, but also there were literally slaves from places like, the Rus, from the Caucasus, you named them, right? So, or the same Persia for that matter. So that wasn't much the thing. It's like with the Janissaries, it's the same identical reason. They were eventually indoctrinated into Islamic theology and religion. They mostly adapted to this social status that actually conferred them an elite, prestigious position within society. In fact, making them able to take over. Again, I'm not explaining here how or why in Islam things work particularly in this way. There were, as you know, some unfree servant knights, even in Germany, for example. This depends on how society is profiled, certain ideological aspects. Is there a difference between Mamluks and Ghulams? Practically not. It's just two different ways of calling them linguistically, but they're still trained slave soldiers, often integrated into Islamic armies. And some of these people maintain properly ethnic regiments, as you've seen, for example, in Egypt. Right, there are the Turks, there are the Sub-Saharians, and they also hate each other, which is quite interesting, but they maintain the balance to some extent. So if you're interested in that story, I didn't just cover a lot of medieval Egyptian warfare, but we talked about the single ethnicities that, at some point were used also by the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, the same Mamluks later on, as they took over as literally like themselves as a case of slave soldiers. As you know, we find these guys quite often in the Islamic-Christian clashes during the Crusades, surpassing nomadic steppe techniques in significance. Why do I say this? Because whenever we talked about steppes warfare, especially in Europe, because these peoples, where or another arrived also in Eastern Europe, one of the single most striking things is from how far away certain war bands could come, right? If there was, a major Ottoman invasion of, Hungary, of the sieges of Vienna, so you're pretty much sure that people from Central Asia, from Eastern Iran, at some point would have arrived, right, through some route to plunder, to loot, undisciplined, rogues, nothing special, really. These were not the Mamluks of, of the same Egypt or again, some, the retinues of some Persian ruler, but don't put limits there to human mobility ever, right? So that many people, especially during the Ottoman Crusades in the Levant, there would have been many people from places, like Transoxanian. And even the same Turkic founded states, of course, like the Seljuks, soon adopted this disciplined professional Mamluks or Ghulam armies. I also talk about the Askaris for the military, the historical military unit series, as far as the Seljuk army was concerned. We will come back that too. It was, of course, an effective way to replenish your manpower against local settled sort of aristocracy that did not want at that point to obey you anymore, because literally that there is also that ethos from Central Asia that is almost a libertarian one. It's actually the product of a shortcoming in general in terms of civilization. They don't obey. This is, again, the Seljuk word is pretty loose, politically speaking. However, the general practice was used also by other European powers close to the steppe. The Hungarians did it all the time. All the refugees that they took from the Mongol invasion before these poured on to the same Hungary, exactly think about the Kumans, the Pechenegs. The Byzantines had done it plenty of times. So what I mean here is that we're talking even relatively familiar people, at least in terms of, the faces you could have dreadfully seen, I don't know, in places like Thrace or Anatolia as a Latin Frankish crusader in the Holy Land. Maybe the same Turcopoles were used in the Crusader army. At some point could be even some Europeans learning how to fight on horseback in a more sort of exotic fashion, even though horse archery was actually fairly common even in the West, even though obviously in a much more subordinated tactical role, given that we had a much bulkier and heavier profile, was an option. Now, the people of Khorasan were known for their expertise in siege engineering as well. As we said before, this place displayed an enormous level of ingenuity, of scientific background, of technological pioneering. Mostly, again, it was it was not even a poor place technically, as we've seen, fertile areas that were essentially urbanized realities. There was always this sense of precarious balance between the sort of the steppe and the sanitary world. So this exposure made people think we can't explain in some very approximate sense. These siege engineers excelled in both defensive and offensive operation. This was a tradition rooted in the region's pre-Islamic history even. I'm going to make a video about this soon because this had historically been the edge of the Sasanian war. There were walls, fortifications against the nomads. Think about the Hephthalites and so on. So there had been a big deal, for example, not just of fortified centers, but also advanced military architecture and general proclivity to sort of defense for obviously the immediate needs of countering the effects of these people's movements that were as terrible as unpredictable. This also reflected Khorasan and Transoxanian's strategic position as a corridor between the urban civilizations of the Middle East, that, needless to say, were very military advanced at the time, and the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppes, facilitating Turkic infiltration through the medieval period. So lots of the troops that eventually would have fought in either place would pass from these places. And in the meanwhile, as knights errant or as simple sort of rogues, as locusts, gaining some sort of consistent military expertise in all the various quarrels and clashes occurring in these areas. Ghaznavid armies epitomized the Islamic tradition of balancing all these different ethnic groups, incorporating Turks, Gulams, and free tribesmen like the Oghuz, that, as we've seen, were a bit like the Trojan horse, at least as much as a part of them will, come to dislodge him as the Seljuks. Tajiks made a video about later, I think, Renaissance-era Tajik warfare for our Eurasian Steppe series. You can check that out if you're interested. We'll talk more about them. As we explained here, mostly Persian-speaking Eastern Iranians, because, of course, like this broader Indo-European background goes as far as Afghanistan. You know that even though that was a bit the wilder place, and these guys, these Iranians came mostly from the West, forming the administrative and cultural backbone of the region. They were the more educated, a bit like, the Greeks. After the Byzantine Empire fell, the Ottomans used them a lot in administration. Then there were the Dailamis that, as we explained, were this warlike people from the mountains of south of the Caspian Sea, known for their infantry prowess. And again, basically holding this incredible, it could have been an ancient way of warring. Literally, infantrymen, and apparently mostly just that. They had some missile capacity to counter cavalry combined armor tactics, but they literally kicked blip across up to Egypt, that were hired by everyone before sort of the Turks came in the 11th century, and they faded a bit away from history. But up to that point, remember that warfare had been consistently also cavalry sort of exposed, to say the least, especially like along the Caspian Sea, but they had been that successful in maintaining essentially just an infantry-based superiority in an era where cavalry was ever more gaining the upper hand. Then you had Arabs, Kurds, and even Indians. It would be very interesting to research. I presume there is really few in terms of in general information about war bands of the specific areas. But as I said before, probably one of the single most, or even the greatest, most underestimated aspect of the whole picture is human mobility, especially with war banders. The core of the Ghaznavid forces, however, consisted of elite Ghulam or Mamluk horsemen. Predictably, they were the men of the hour, right, in the general landscape, trained both as horse archers and close combat cavalry wielding spears, swords, and mace. I mean, the basic melange, elite heavies, few of them, like lots of horse archers all around. There is a pretty standard picture here. If you look, I made videos, for example, about, Asiatic heavy and light cavalrymen from, say, the 6th to the 11th century. Pretty much this had already been the thing since ever. And probably the moment in which the Turks had sort of taken over the steppes. The Ghurids, emerging from mountainous regions, initially relied on infantry akin to the Dailamis. Interestingly enough, because you get a bit like, the Magyars, this peoples that eventually we got to know because of their equestrian capacities that were initially sedentaries at large and not even particularly inclined. I mean, they had cavalry, but not even much surplus or sort of capacity to get many. As soon as they sprang out, remember what you said here about the Dailamis, in fact, we just compared them to the early Ghurids. It's pretty similar picture. They employed large karva shields to form shield walls reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon tactics, but it's just for the poetic visual. Obviously, you always discover that there are actually adult males who believed that shield walls are a tactic of some sort. That's not actually the case. It's always about spears and missiles, etc. But it's just from the external, of course, especially in an area where this infantry had to cope with a lot of horse archery. Undeniably, you had to put on the fore this pretty wide shields. This is in Europe. We have this with the Slavic shield designs. From the Balkans to Eastern Europe, we have this crescent of particular designs. The squared, rectangular, big, large. Cornered shield that, like a camping table that you have to fix in front of it. It's not quite the Pavese. It's better if I don't open that parenthesis, but we talked about the Pavese. Also the Lithuanian one, besides the Italian one, that is the one that really sort of spread things more. It's not a surprise because in Italy was the greatest concentration on crossbow power, and in absolute terms, imagine you are instead a farmer in the steppes, because technically in some areas, or at least bordering the steppes, there are sedentary people, communities, and even if you maybe are the same mounted raider, you need at some point to stand your ground, say, especially in defending a certain hilltop, a village, whatever, protecting yourself from arrows. And especially if you're cornered, you're pinned down, and as we've seen, these guys did not really have much armor to begin with. Well, the shield is the best answer. And the objective is properly pairing as many projectiles as you can to sort of get there, right, to hope to survive in a way. So these guys initially, like naturally when they pass to a more mounted profile, at that point, you don't need much shields or big shields. At that point, speed, missile capacity is more like the maneuvering, collective training is the best, right? But as a normal sort of random sedentary person having the poor luck of being born in places like this, well, that was the best tactic somehow. In some areas in the broader region we're describing here, again, think about Afghanistan, were heavily, mountainous, not even suited at all for mounted combat. That's why exactly from some of these peoples emerged from similar environments and terrains. Now, the Ghaznavid region was long renowned for manufacturing and exporting weapons, armor, and helmets. They were a massive power at the beginning of this period during the High Middle Ages. By the mid-12th century, the Ghurids instead had a mounted elite capable of effective combat on foot as well. It was normal. Think about the contemporary Normans. Mounted and dismounted is absolutely normal as well. It had always existed to a degree. The elite is always trained to basically array itself in any kind of formation, performing any type of tactic. By the end of the 12th century, the Ghurids fielded substantial cavalry with kilted horse armor, rooted in Sasanian traditions, rather than the Turkic or Chinese lamellar, interestingly enough. It's not like the latter didn't have kilted, but there was something visibly more reminiscent of, again, those Persian traditions as opposed to some Turkic or even Chinese influence. This is fascinating indeed, and it also shows a bit like the gradual development of a force that is initially rough mountaineers, eventually sort of start maturing some sort of more elite force. You see how here the landscape is feudalizing to a degree. It's not much that they're enriching themselves for some reason. Admittedly, during the High Middle Ages, there was a coming back of the entire Eurasia. But it's mostly a societal development, and at that point you have the strong elites also capable of hiring, as we've seen, Mamluks / Gulams, so you could take them from other places. And so they start playing this game. But as far as their sort of visual side of their appearance, they looked still somehow more distinctly Iranian, right? Turkic military and cultural influences naturally spread soon, as we've seen, through eastern Iran, Afghanistan, and northern India, following the Seljuk conquests in particular, even penetrating traditional strongholds like Sijistan. In the early 13th century, the Mongols, a nomadic confederation from the Mongolian steppes under Genghis Khan, known for their unparalleled military organization and conquest, conquered, in fact, most of the region as well, sparing only Kashmir and modern Pakistan, though they conducted devastating raids there as well. As you know, the Indian subcontinent was spared from the Mongol invasions. However, this whole area was overrun. It's not like it was steamrolled, razed to the ground. As you understand, also from the previous centuries, like there would always be some important continuity with a properly Persian background. This is really important in the region. It's almost like a leitmotif of the entire era. In fact, after the Mongol Empire's fragmentation in the mid-13th century, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan fell to the Ilkhans, a Mongol dynasty ruling Persia and adopting Persian culture and Islam, so the Shia one. In fact, that is somehow rare because the Turks and the Mongols historically had remained mostly, at least those who had converted to Islam, Sunni. All right. In the West, we have more the Tatars than the Mongols, but there were Mongol dynasties that came to rule over there, Tolkien, the Golden Horde, and so on. This tells you, again, what I was hinting at before, how continuous sort of Persian civilization is, in spite of all these regime changes, let's put it in this way. The Ilkhans, as this domination governed until the early 14th century, when at least the region fragmented once again. At least the Ilkhans remained there, but they lost some of these pieces together with the broader crisis also of the 14th century that had all the, also the bigger Mongol Empire collapse, like the communications. And, what's happening there. I was thinking about a brilliant expression, but, yes, the end of the Pax Mongolica. And that's it. So what does happen? There is, of course, in the mid-14th century, we normally stop mostly at this chronological height with this series, but you can see essentially the same dynamic of political, in part political consolidation, but on a more provincial basis. Khorasan split between the Karts, for example, was a local dynasty based in Herat, known for their resistance to Mongol dominance, by the way, and the Sarbadars, a revolutionary Shia movement in Zabzazar that briefly established a populist state of some sort, while Afghanistan, in general, was in the broader sort of the other areas, was divided among the Kurds and various local rulers contesting Baluchistan in the south as well. So it's again a quite interesting scenario. Not one of great situation. There is the Black Death. There is a lot of collapse, of shrinking of power, but also some more local consolidation. Transoxania and Turkestan from Khwarezmia to Western Mongolia came under the Yagatai Khans. This was the Mongol dynasty famously named after Chagatai. It was Genghis Khan's son who ruled Central Asia and adopted Islam as well. They also controlled territory south of the Amu Darya, so the Oxus River, by the mid-14th century. Like the Ilkhans, the Yagatai or Chagatai Khans adopted Islam, but descended themselves into anarchy by the late 14th century. Lots of dynastic issues. Mostly the local oligarchies were consolidating. The local dynasties were thus also increasingly depending on them. All this is perturbed compared to what we see in the West by, again, this hybrid sort of semi-civilized context. In fact, this step did not really help maintaining political stability, but it's also a bit the era. It's a bit, as we've seen in different other parts of the world, there's a lot of dynasties going extinguished. There is a sort of involution, probably a will of power. A great secularization and modernization of thought, by the way, after the peak of the 13th century, the Mongol conquest, for example. The Mongol and post-Mongol periods saw gradual changes in Eastern Islamic arms, armor, and military traditions under Central Asian influence. We will see it better again in the video about the iconographic and archaeological dimension, though these transformations were notably slow as well, underscoring the resilience of indigenous styles. Again, by the mid-14th century, male armor, including fabric-covered and padded garments like the Kazaghan and kaftan padded jackets, often reinforced with mail worn by cavalry, declined in popularity. This is really common. We've seen it also for Western Iran. Basically, when the Mongols arrive, lamellars start, spawning everywhere, and it's really not strange. The Mongols really sort of heavily broke probably the backbone of the local militaries and politics. It's not like if, from a social cultural point of view, and in terms of manpower and labor force, they were reliant locally on the inhabitants of the region. The latter, the Mongol invasions, nothing happens. This almighty, Persian civilization that absorbs everything per se. Civilization here is better termed as culture, rather. And so there is really a big deal of change, importantly, even in arms and armor. We've seen it again also in the video about Western Iran. What rather strikes is that things like the Kazaghan kaftan had remained up to that point. Like this almost Sasanian kind of, for example, mail historically had, admittedly been used all over most Western Eurasia. Also because of a lot of Western influence. I mean, even the Volga Bulgars at some point imported, German mail, right? It's that far east that Western civilization reaches against all sort of weird. You see, China does not have this rich, geographically speaking, and there are many reasons for this that I highlighted in some videos. Some people sometimes attack me because they say, oh no, China, well, of course, that's mostly because of their weird, strange exoticism, Orientalism. This is also typical of sort of post-Vietnam trauma sort of syndrome in American culture, that the East was always more advanced and special, and they had, their different way that was actually superior to the West. Look, I studied this stuff for years and years, right? And it doesn't seem that is the case. I've never honestly downplayed the sort of scope and in essence of Chinese warfare that was surely comparable to Western one in terms of development of scale and so on. but there are also some differences within the same level that must be understood. What here is striking, rather, is that, of course, like things like mail, padded armor, different combinations of the same, because this, of course, existed also in the central steppes, had survived in quite distinctive fashion in Persia up to the Mongol invasion. So again, it seems that even though the Turks took over, they never really sort of watered down this in fact, Turkic sort of Iranian military style, and it's something we will really have to focus more in the prodromes of. I mean, we rarely talk about Sasanian warfare in due fashion, so I think it's time. We recently came to talk a bit more about Persia, especially as far as medieval warfare is concerned. Never quite a bad thing, right? Because regardless of the legitimate antipathy for how Iran has turned to be historically by this point, at the time, there is really a lot to learn from it, and as we've seen also in recent videos in terms of with the Romans, etc. Also in this case, yeah, you can admire them, but also have to realize that they were sort of the more unstable, the weaker actually system, and in political. So unity is different from spiritual unity. People still somehow conceive Europe during the Middle Ages some fractally backward place. I don't know what's wrong in their head. I mean, where I come from, it doesn't even take to have gone to university to know that wasn't a thing. But spiritual unity is the key there. Like, if you have been radically indoctrinated by Marxist extremism, ever since you've set foot at university, you hate the West as much as you hate yourself, because that's also the only way to... Well, it's obvious that you're not going to understand much about how or why religion, the moral dimension, is what actually makes a civilization, not sort of matter or predetermined mechanisms. But going back to our topic here, around the Mongol era, in this Eastern Iranian context, horse armor, naturally a constant feature in Eastern Islam as well, shifted from padded or kilted forms to hardened leather lamellar. So their softer armor was actually also restyled along essentially the Mongol outlook, but also reflecting the growing importance of horse archery as well, and archery in particular. This aspect is also fascinating. I made videos about lamellar armor in particular, and we've explained why tendentially this type of armor it's better suited, especially for horse, and especially sort of horse archery, at least in protecting from archers from other archers when you are on horseback. It is fascinating also in this context that before the Mongol era, Iran maintained some kind of different opinion about this, and they had historically lots of horse archery as well, but they eventually had some sort of bulkier, heavier, probably sort of knightly profile for the more heavily armored, and they had also had probably a quite consistent infantry component as well. It's a bit as you have understood here, but the elephant in the room, that there are areas in this feudalized world that sparks, like for again, cavalry question stuff, think about the cataphracts of the previous centuries and so on, but that at the end of the day is a sanitary world and has a lot of foot infantry troops. So when the Mongols arrive, there is evidently some sort of pretty sound break collapse. Cavalry increases in importance. The Mongols dictate their own style of warfare. And this is something, by the way, we've seen also in the videos about sort of steppes warfare across the entire Eurasia. There's a video here, I will surely again post it in the top fix link down below, but it was about the Eurasian, the steppes during or before the Mongol era that explained exactly this aspect. That is to say, certain Central Asian peoples, so also akin to the Mongols themselves, in the broader Turkic world. No, it is not steppe, but it's the Mongol. Excuse me, I'm just searching on the YouTube account. Yeah, it's this one. Eurasian steppes warfare Mongol era. Yeah, this is, but there is surely some other, I don't remember, maybe Eastern Eurasian steppes warfare, something like that, which I describe how some areas of Central Asia, of the steppes, among which there were also sedentaries. Here we're not talking Transoxanian areas that were a bit of a blend, but like places that you've never even heard of, because also were relatively small, in the midst of nowhere, probably in Siberia, that had, however, naturally sort of for the times and places, dramatically advanced military technology, that the Mongols came also to subsume when they took over. In areas that were, for example, like the Volga Bulgars, that are a bit more sort of west, but barely, and other areas around that had, for example, had lots of mail around, or other types of armor, and you can absolutely date from an archaeological point of view the moment in which the Mongols arrived, because everything turns into lamellar. I say everything, of course, in a virtual sense, but the Mongol conquests were really something, and they were really that impacting on local customs. So it's not really strange that in Persia similar things happened like this as well. Naturally, as we explained, the Ilkhanate, arsenals, logistics, and so on were something that the Mongols could use that they couldn't use in other places around, including most of the ones we're actually dealing with here, because that happened mostly in Western Iran, where they could build that kind of regional power to begin with, also controlling these other areas. But it's also interesting that in those same places, the Mongols tend to settle their own Mongols of the first generations, so that hadn't been merged into the local populations yet, in some steppe borderland, because that's exactly how they would have to live, right? When you look at the Golden Horde, most of their territory was actual steppe, so it's not surprising. That's where their oil fields lay, right? For invading Europe, for example, that's from north of the Caucasus around the Caspian Sea, the Volga, and so on. There was Sarai there. It would be the later capital, in fact, of the Golden Horde from Volga, Bulgar times. But there are steppe areas. In here, there are steppe areas, but they're outer compared to Persia, especially the western part. And yet the Mongols have to settle there because they wouldn't know how to literally have their armies work otherwise, because they had just always habituated to rule from the steppes, to have troops mobilized from the steppes. It's a bit like in China. It's not like Mongol cavalry is transplanted into China. There are ways to support certain troops that, however, become fundamentally Chinese in some generation. But the oil fields, that's this expression that I use, probably the pastures, the grazing ground for the horses, for just the nomadic lifestyle that brought the Mongols to be a warlike people, was in Mongolia. It also remained a hellhole, telling the truth. After the Mongol conquest, it's not like Mongolia became they became perhaps, they opened more to the system, but they remained what they were. There wasn't much capacity of changing to begin with. Now, the Mongols and their successors employed sophisticated fire weapons in siege warfare. We know this well, especially given their Chinese influence, as we were just explaining, was mostly a merit of Chinese civilization. In fact, there were the so-called Chinese arrows with naft, or so-called Greek fire cartridges. Last spring I made a video about so-called Greek fire, sea fire, liquid fire, whatever you want to call it. So we do find this in eastern Iran as well after the Mongol invasion. You can rightly point out that surely the Persians had historically had similar weapons. By the way, we know that the Chinese imported artillerists from the Caliphate, from essentially they were Arabs, but Mesopotamia, the Bazids, they were heavily Persified, culturally speaking. That's yet another very important dynamic under al-Mamun. The Caliphate of Baghdad could actually convert to Shia Islam. That's a story for another video. I made something already, but still. And you see that the Mesopotamian oil wells, the actual oil fields in this time of petroleum treated as naphtha, etc., were exactly just at hand of these peoples, right? The same Byzantines that created a bit their own mythology surrounding Greek fire, probably everybody really used also elsewhere, is that there was always, at least they had the best formula, the best chemical combination, whatever. But I mean, they literally imported the petroleum, the oil from the Caliphate for this stuff. So also proving that it was not much of a secret, nor, if somebody wanted to cripple that ability to use it, they could block their import. Of course, that's not how military technology would have worked. This stuff was, you could find it was sold. It was not a big deal to begin with. Like, say, it's not Greek fire that really makes armies work per se. And in fact, as we've seen also in that video last spring, largely overrated in general terms. The point I was making here is that these these incendiary devices were fundamentally part of the broader Persian world from quite a while. Perhaps not so overwhelmingly, famous in particular context, especially in the Iranian plateau from military accounts, all this stuff, but that's also a problem of sources. There is even some mystical connection with fire in Iran that we talked in our last sort of Indo-European series, video series. Saltpeter, the key component distinguishing true gunpowder from Greek fire, was introduced to Khorasan and eastern Iran from China around 1230, apparently. Right? We don't really know the history of how this happened, who invented what, who found out what, who innovated how. Here you see Khorasan, for example, dramatically advanced from a scientific point of view, but they had this technology taken from China, apparently. There is also a point out that in this broader eastern Iranian theater, the adoption of firearms remained notably slow. Right? You don't have this overwhelming spread of, use at least of firearms, because these cultures are, first of all, generally speaking, poor. They don't have a lot of surplus. They have mostly just nomadic warfare. There isn't even this enormous amount of siege warfare, if not in some areas, as we've seen, that also get gradually leveled by all these invasions. So what could remain of this Sasanian fortificatory system sort of was gradually flattened. Of course, naturally, in the later Middle Ages, you find firearms. There is also a cultural preconception, because these are feudal cultures. They don't like firearms that much. Mostly it's lack of availability. And as I explained in other videos about other context and the spread of firearms, it's not like, guns are there or not, right? At this point, wherever you find it, whenever firearms are around, you know that they are literally everywhere. So it's not a surprise, it's not a mystery. The problem is how much availability you have for this extra sort of surplus kind of also costly equipment, technology, and so on. And you wouldn't even, especially in these areas around the steppe, so much need them. I mean, how would you use firearms in Mongolia at some point? Everything remained much more traditional. This, again, there were guns, there were cannons later on and so on. There's no doubt about this. But especially in the more steppe areas, I mean, some of these places are really poor, are really rural, are really also steppe to a degree. So it's completely normal not to have a big deal of artillery to begin with, because it's simply inconsistent, like incoherent with the nature of warfare that remains primarily nomadic. We know from the Golden Horde that gunners were mocked because apparently they were stinky as the devil because of the sulfur there, but they still adopted guns. It's rather the fact that, again, these places are not as developed, resourceful, innovative and growing, like, for example, Europe, that in this point is sort of say, augmenting firearms power, for example, more than what happens in China, seemingly, even. And there, at some point, these peoples, even though provided with firearms, will not be able to cope with, for example, pike and shot warfare. That's how the Tsarists took over Siberia, basically. But and so there is an implacable and unforgiving historical testing that you can't ignore, that you can't act as if you didn't see it, and so everything, I believe, that makes sense in the broader picture. Again, I realize sometimes by making videos like the other day's one about scholarly, or how many people are completely oblivious of the fact that there is a pretty well-known and studied comparative capacity of realizing how armies, people, civilization fought across time and space. It may be true that it's not a very humble thing to say, but I'm not here to be humble. I may be the only person in the world, or the person who does this more and better at this point, and that objectively I still haven't found a single person who does what I do. Again, without any modesty, I don't give a damn about that, but I think it's true. And I can tell you that it does feel lonely out here, because when you speak and you also say, I think, pretty obvious things to a degree about all this stuff, and people do not seem to properly even enter the context of what you're talking about, well, it's as if you were talking to a wall, all right? So I am here, how many videos about medieval Asia, mostly about medieval Asian warfare, by the way. Have I done so far? Let's simply give a look at that. Medieval Asian warfare, this is the 90th video about that, right? I can't claim a level of experience, even it's not much about the depth. Obviously, I'm not an expert in these topics. I publish work, research on different things. I don't really get very much. But, I mean, how many people have done what I have done here, talking for hours in each of these 90 videos about a very specific medieval Asian warfare thing and connecting it to all the other thousands of videos. When you have to explain it to others, that's the moment when you really acquire. I say it out of sheer experience, because I wasn't like this before. I became that. It completely changes your mind. It completely changes the way you wire to these topics, and it doesn't become a matter of guess. It is fundamentally a matter of, okay, I know the answer because I've seen it, and I'm not guessing, right? It's there. Right, I show it to you, and so again, there is always an important level of. It's important to keep the debate open. It's not like I'm not saying for scholars, or I'm just reflecting about comments. Then people wonder why I don't comment things, or why some people I block, because some you see, when somebody tells you you think that Europe was so mighty and China was much greater and you're a racist, you're an idol. I mean, it's as if I was talking about a yacht and you were talking about, I don't know, what kind of paintings you have on the wall at home. I mean, they have no attendance to whatever I'm doing here. All right, and especially after making so much work about, say, medieval Chinese warfare and reiterating what I just did also, for example, in this video about the fundamental sort of comparison between the two civilizations, and hearing such idiotic things, then you wonder why I block people, and I actually am very happy to do so, and as you see, I'm not even hiding that. So I would like to, if anything, and I do with most of subscribers, but let's say, but people who don't know me, just be aware of the fact that this channel is not, I'm not saying it's the best channel, you're going to have fun, this is so entertaining. No. But what you find in this channel, you will not find any freaking where else. All right, and there's a very specific reason why this is the case. So you have to enter that state of mind before approaching my content. You have to understand where I come from with this all. And especially consider that I have literally like 2,500 videos out there that everybody can check out and sort of confirm what I've been doing, on which basis, with which. And there isn't the shortcut, right? This is not the sort of Redditor kind of every kind of Generation Z mentality. There are no standards because there is no quality, there is no value, there is no tradition anymore. I don't play that game. In other words, I don't give a damn about anyone, especially of you. I give a damn about those that I care about because they demonstrate to understand this, because they share the same background of knowledge that they can relate with. Misunderstanding happens, but when it is excessive and sort of completely delirating, that's not something you have to show any kind of respect or consideration towards, because that's nothing, and as such it must be treated. All right. Again, nothing really happened here. It's not like there was drama or any particular thing, but it's just a reminder of the fact that I'm not doing this for I can't say charity or fun or either. It's something like that I do for reasons that probably I can't even fully articulate myself. I just know it works and it helps me in my work. And also in my life, in the sense that what I learned from this is amazing, and it helps me with other people. It helps me, with the few people I care about, because it widens my horizons in ways that I didn't think I would ever. And so everything political, military, and social here seems incredibly clear. But anyhow, so as I was saying, again, we'll make actually another video about this because we have to look at the probably hardware of this. Probably won't be an enormous video. Also, I have to some degree store this, because every time I make a video, for example, I don't know how this will be received, but I don't know, every time I make a video about Indian warfare, nobody watches. I have to gradually dilute this for times of higher views. That's also why I made this video today, for example, because I thought I wouldn't be one of the most watched. And so I attempted this. But anyhow, there is really plenty of lots of interesting stuff. And this is, pretty much for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.